We were between two evils. It was the communists and then the Nazis. The war did not stop for us.
There were Ukrainians from eastern Ukraine and Galicia and from Volyn, and we all, with horses and wagons, we were moving west. We didn't know where we were going to go, but we needed to flee away from the Russians.
The Soviets, their track record was atrocious. The German track record was atrocious. And they wind up, as it were, between hammer and anvil, between a rock and a hard place.
Some people may be ashamed or want to forget this whole story. To me, what's important to pass on to my children is their heritage. To know that they come from a nation that has a lot to be proud of.
The Nazis and the Soviets signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. This is in August of 1939. The Germans attack Poland, and then the Soviets respond. And they occupy Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, or if you like, Eastern Poland. And the rationale for the occupation is not that this is an aggression, but that they are liberating Ukrainians and Belarusians from Polish landlord rule and annexing them to the Soviet Union.
When they crossed the border, Polish radio was saying, oh, they're coming, across the border, they're coming, but we don't know if they're coming to help us or what.
As the Soviet army occupied Western Ukraine, the vast majority of the soldiers were Ukrainians who spoke Ukrainian, sang Ukrainian songs. All right, and for many West Ukrainians, this was simply a shock. It's like, oh my God, Nashi, right? Our soldiers are taking over. So there was a, a kind of, let's say, neutral, something between neutrality and welcoming.
My father was a priest in the village, and we had a wonderful children's life. We had a big garden, and we had fruit trees, and I was climbing all the way to the top. It was free of worries. Now, when the Russians came, it was a different story.
When the Russians came, they thought that my family was kurkuli, which means we're the rich ones. So they decided to take everything away from us. They put a notice out into the village that anybody can come and buy whatever they want from the house and around the whole estate.
Я народилася в Старому Самбурі, бо мій батько був мадяр, а мама українка. That's my father. And that's my mother. Батько робив меблі, а крім того, що він був бізнесмен, очевидно, почалася біда. Тому, що буржуй нас націоналізували, значить, все від нас відібрали. Ми жили в такій фабриці, але фабрика була не наша вже. А щомісяця, що 2-3 місяці був директор російський. То він відразу прийшов до татка і сказав йому так: Женя, машини є тут. Вони ще не всі вмонтовані, і ніхто не вміє на них робити. Пам'ятай одне, як тільки ти навчиш людей, як працювати на тих машинах, твоя дорога на Сибір відкрита. Так що я тобі раджу, ти будь осторожний і роби все помалу.
Initially, Soviets targeted Poles and Jews. Several hundred thousand are deported from Western Ukraine off to Siberia. By late 40, it's the Ukrainians' turn. There's a crackdown on the church. There's a crackdown on academic institutions. There's a crackdown on cultural institutions, right? And this, of course, is part and parcel of the imposition of a Stalinist order.
It was your duty under the communist system to tell the government about your neighbor. So you spied on me, I spied on somebody else spied on you, and they kept records. Furthermore, they would reward some of the people who tell on their neighbors and severely punish the, quote, guilty ones. And that system created tremendous fear.
As a young girl, I cannot forget it. In the morning when I went to school, I could see trucks loaded with people crying because they were sent to Siberia. So then, after school, I used to go to a market and look for our villagers and ask them if my parents are still home or maybe they are sent to Siberia, and I was left orphaned.
When the Soviets came to the village, within a week, a member of the village council came to my father and said, I saw a list of people from the village that are supposed to be arrested, and you were on that list. As soon as he heard that, they started making plans to escape. Within about a week, they took their horses and wagon and left. When we came to the river, right on the border, they found out exactly when the border patrol were changing. So they got into the river. They looked back and the new patrol was approaching. And one of the horses started to lie down. Now, I always get emotional when I talk about that because it was like a miracle. She had a Blessed Virgin Mary icon, and she pulled it out and she said, please help us. And she said, like a miracle, that horse got up and started going.
Because my father had been a political prisoner and because he was working as a journalist, he was almost certainly targeted for execution, certainly arrest. And so my mother and father, they fled Lviv and ended up in what was then Nazi-occupied Poland. They got a letter from my mother's sister who was in Soviet-occupied Ukraine. And she writes, life has never been this good. We're just so pleased that the Soviets have come and everything is so great. I think I can only compare it to the great time we had. Remember that wedding on June whatever, 1938? Well, that was the night my grandfather died. And so this was her way of saying, you know, God, it's awful. This is hell.
То були тяжкі часи. Це, що нас не чіпали татка і той, але за це взялися до старшого брата. Його вивезли на Запоріжжя, і він був на Запоріжжю, цілий рік працював там, в тюрмі. Він прийшов до хати. За 2 тижні вибухла війна. І його вже не арештували як звичайну людину, його арештували як українського націоналіста.
All of a sudden we hear the shooting on both sides of the river. And on one side are the Ukrainian underground, on the other side they're Russians, because they are withdrawing. And my father says, let's run quickly under the bridge, you know, and hide under the bridge. And we hear the bullets coming down. I was petrified. And my father says, we probably will die, but it's okay because we're going to be together. I truly thought that that was the end of my life. You know? And then, would you believe, all of a sudden comes a German Jeep.
By the time the Germans attack, I'd say the vast majority of Western Ukrainians have now developed a very strong antipathy to Soviet rule. That's then enhanced by the fact that as the Germans attacked, the Soviets had something like 30,000 political prisoners in West Ukrainian prisons. In that week, between June 22nd and roughly July 1st, they systematically kill the vast majority of those prisoners.
Вже совєти, ті, що були в старому Самбурі, що як їх везли зі старого Самбура, перед нашою фабрикою зіпсувалося авто. That's our factory in Старий Самбір. That's my brother, older brother. Вони всі в машині, то була тягарова машина. Лежали, а наверху було зілля всіляке, щоб не було видно, кого вони везуть. Молодший брат був в місті, і він знав, що діється. Прийшов до хати, відразу сказав, що там є наш брат гень. Тоді приїхала друга машина, і вони всі мали пересісти з цієї машини на другу машину. Очевидно, мамця почала кричати. А я ще була спокійна, але як брат переходив, я вибігла з хати, кричала. Ми знали всі, де їх везуть. Їх повезли всіх до Самбура. В Самбурі щодня на подвір'ї розстрілювали в'язнів.
Not only do they kill them, in many instances, they first torture them in bestial fashion, doing things like poking out their eyes, cutting off their breasts if they were women, cutting off their genitals if they're men. I mean, sort of really awful things taking place. And then they kill them. As the Soviets withdraw, at each step of the way, the Ukrainians open up the prisons in order to free their friends, and they come upon heaps and heaps of rotting bodies.
І мою сестру, як вона мала 20 років, вона теж належала, заарештували большевики. І 41-го року у Дрогобицькій тюрмі її замордували. Знаєте, там всіх мордували, всі. То там потім, то було в червні, і якби возили, декого витягали з тої тюрми і клали так на землю, клали, бо то їх було багато. То ми з мамою ходили там дивитися, бо то вже не було Дюня тоді. Вона мала такі чудові чорні коси, моя мамочка носила з собою ножиці, що коси вона відтяти, ми не знайшли її. Ми її не знайшли і так ніколи, пішла до праці, більше не вернулася.
An uncle of mine was one of the victims, and my mother related to me that when the prison was opened, they found no prisoners in the prison. And then someone started stomping around in the backyard, and they noticed that the ground was soft. And they started digging up the ground, and they realized that they came upon a mass grave. And she was there. She was actually a witness to this. And they were taking out the bodies one by one, and his wasn't there. And she thought that maybe he escaped, or maybe they were evacuated, right? In any case, he seems to have survived. And before leaving, she decided to take one last look into this huge ditch, and she saw a hand sticking out of the mud. And they dug out the body, and it was him.
Oh, here is my parents when I went to First Holy Communion the day before he was murdered. He's right here, my mom, and this is me. At the end of June 1941, the female witness talked to 2 political prisoners who had managed to escape alive out of the town prison. The witness, SD, estimates the number of persons who were murdered at 105 tortures and executions which were carried out on June 22nd and June 23rd. Usually took place in the cellars. Many of the victims were scalded with boiling water. Of those who were murdered, the bodies of Dr. Roman Kulczycki, a lawyer of the town, and Andrei Bodnar, my father, both inhabitants of the town, were identified. So this is a story of the whole story.
So the entrance of the Germans coincides precisely with the uncovering of these atrocities. And if there were any doubts on the part of Ukrainians that the Soviets were evil, this dissipated those doubts altogether. So there was a welcoming. The Germans come in and people see them as liberators.
I remember when the Germans came, people were happy because they didn't know who the Germans were. I know my parents thought that they were cultured people. They expected something good from them, and they knew what they had lived through, that they had lived through 1933 famine.
It's called the Holodomor. When Stalin, through forced collectivization, created a famine in Ukraine, in a land that is the breadbasket of Europe. I mean, this was not due to drought or any kind of natural disasters. It was man-made famine.
My grandfather died of starvation. He was 57. My uncle was 19. So we knew what the communists were, and we did not know what the Nazis were. But we found out very soon what the Germans were.
The Germans had brought about the Enlightenment. They were considered to be the most cultured, most civilized nation of Europe. No one was expecting them to bring Auschwitz, as it were, into Ukraine.
If you read Mein Kampf, Hitler tells exactly what he's going to do. He said he's going to reunite the German-speaking territories, which he did. Second, get rid of the Jews, which was what he tried to do with the Holocaust. Three, he said he's going to annex what he called Lebensraum. Lebensraum is living space, and Lebensraum, Ukraine. And why Ukraine? Because of its food production. The people who lived there, the Ukrainians and other Slavs, he called them Untermenschen, subhuman. They would become the slaves to the Germans. As the German nation grew, Germans would then become inhabitants of Lebensraum, at which point the Untermenschen, the subhumans, they would be exterminated. Jews were made to wear the yellow Star of David during the Nazi era. Ukrainians and other Slavs wore this patch, Ost, East. My mother's letters to my father, they survived. She lived through Nazi occupation. She called them smerkachi, snot-nosed Nazi soldiers. She witnessed the massacres and people being hanged. The roundup and deportation of Jews and young people forced to work in the Nazi economy, either in factories, coal mines, farms.
Вони там працювали, що вони, бо німці, як не мали людей робочих до роботи, то вони забирали навіть з України, лапали людей і посилали до Німеччини, знаєш, бо там не було робітників. І ті люди всі робили, мусили робити на тій фармі. I remember one boy, he was from Ukraine, and he got sick on a field. And that man, that boss that was behind him, with the cane, and he says, you better get up and go to work or die. Don't about concentration camp or anything, but when they treat us as slaves.
There was a time when the Germans started to pick up the young people to go to Germany. My brother, older brother, was ready to go, and myself, but we have some people who were trying to protect us, and they give us the job. So we were saved, but in the meantime we enrolled into Ukrainian nationalist organization. It was illegal. We could not admit to anybody. We were very strict.
Я належала до Організації українських націоналістів молодечого відділу. І я була розвідтиця. Ані батько, ані мама, ніхто не знав, ані браття не знали, ніхто не знав. То було дуже секретне все зроблено. Одного разу вони приїхали 2 автами тягаровими. Пішли до бюра, там балакати з татком і так далі. А на машинах стоять кріси, дістаю штафету. Що я мушу зорганізувати то. А у нас була ще одна дівчина, така, що мешкала в нас. Я кажу, слухай, Адельчу, там стоїть той мадяр, такий гарний, молодий. Іди трохи романсуй з ним. Сама пішла, взяла один кріс, а я мала чоботи, такі досить широкі тут вгорі, що тут можна було набої сховати. Я мала щось 20 крівиків ангорових. І я до тої клітки, під ті кривики, ті кріси сховала. Що, пішла на гору спокійно, сиджу, вчуся щось там, щось пишу. Крик страшний, фабрику цілу замкнули. Шукають за тими крісами. Це було з півдня. Нічого не знайшли. Поїхали. Татко висварився на братів, бо татко знав, що вони до організації належать. Так. Каже, ти знаєш, як було б знайшли, то було б нас розстріляли. Розстріляли, каже. Що ви зробили? Ані один, ані другий нічого не знає. На другий день приходить молодший брат до мене. Ти тепер скажи, де ти їх сховала? Я не знаю. Чому я? Ну, бо хтось з нас мусив то зробити. Ми не зробили, то ти, певно, зробила. Так, іди візьми, кажу, там стоять, іди візьми. Ну, і тоді треба було втікати.
Because of our connection with the Ukrainian national movement, somebody who probably, unfortunately, there are always some people that tell Gestapo, and one night the Gestapo arrested my father, my cousin, and myself. This was the last time I saw my father. We were transported to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was the largest concentration camp of women. There was 18,000 women from all over the Europe. And on the other side, there was a crematorium where they were burning night and day all the prisoners that they were dead. And you had that smell constant. Yeah. Like I said, those little things, it's so hard to imagine if you've never been there, and for someone to try to tell you, even as much as you would like to paint the picture, it's not possible.
Finally, the time is coming. that the Germans are beginning to lose on the Eastern Front. And as they were losing the war, we began to worry what was going to happen when the Russians come back. We decided that we're not going to make it the second time around. And we decided to flee.
And this is my mother and father, their wedding day. A lot of young men, and especially the young intelligentsia, joined the German army to fight against the Russians, but only on the Eastern Front. They would never fight against the Allies. And unfortunately, they were betrayed by the Germans because once the battle began, the Germans retreated and they were left to fight the Russians alone. Consequently, a vast majority of these people perished, my father being one of them. We never saw him again.
By the spring of 1944, the front had moved past where my mother was. The Ukrainian insurgent army, UPA, were hiding in caves around her village. And she was forced, along with the other villagers, to witness young men being hanged by the Red Army. And this was very traumatic for her.
In 1944, we decided to move west, and we knew that my father would have been very under scrutiny for his patriotic work in Ukraine. One morning we woke up, an officer visited the house, and he gave me a gun and said, "Malchik, little boy, who shall we shoot today? Germans or Russians?" And naturally, my parents froze because our family was not only against Germans, but were vehemently against the communists. So they were concerned what I was going to say. And I said, "We're going to shoot the Germans. The Russians are our friends." He took the gun away from me. And he said, "Okay, soldiers, we're leaving. Everything is fine."
The front was only 6 kilometers, which is, 4 miles away. We didn't have a car. And so my father loaded the wagon, driven by horses. And you should see the road. The road was packed with people, children, and we were almost walking because our wagons were loaded with whatever parents could remember to put on.
Я зараз не знала, що я маю робити, чи я маю лишати, чи ні, тому що я мала хвору дитину, 2 роки, хлопчик, мав запалення легенів, і я не могла його лишити, я не хотіла його лишити. Але мій тато, father-in-law, каже, твої батьки пішли, то як прийдуть большевики, то вони заберуть нас і тебе на Сибір. І він мені каже, ми дитиною заопікуємося, а ти йдеш за чоловіком. То, що сталося. І я пішла. То було в 44-му році, 7 марця.
We were leaving the city in the middle of the night or going on towards morning, and my mother's brother and sister, I guess, were there, and they were trying to take my little coat off and said, "No, what are you going to do with 2 little children?" My sister was literally a few months old, and we'll keep Arata at home. She'll be fine, and once the war is over, once this fighting is over, you'll be reunited. And the last minute, my mother just took my little coat, put it back on me, and she says, "No, where I go, my children go with me."
I was left behind with my mother to look after the property, the home,
because everyone believed that in a few years or whenever the war would blow over and they would come back. No one would believe that they kept going on and on west. It took some months, but the underground soldiers helped my mother go through the mountains. We were saved really by whatever my mother saved of the gold jewelry, gold pieces. She traded that for our freedom. So they would pick up the fence, you would crawl to the other side of the border, and they were saying, if they catch you, we didn't see you.
My mother did a terrific job shielding us from all these horrors of bombing, the tortures, or anything that people were going through by telling us stories of Hans Christian Andersen. I mean, it was like stories of 1,001 Nights. And also reading some of the little Ukrainian stories that she brought with me. And I still have, to this day, I still have those couple books. All of this, I believe, and my mother did firmly too believe, that it was all in God's hands. If you were not a believer, you certainly became a believer at that time.
І ми останнім поїздом зі Старого Самбора виїхали на Мадярщину. Мадяри нікого не приймали. Можна було переїхати через Мадярщину, але не прийняли.
Again, the Russian front was approaching very close. So our parents, they had to pick the most important things that they could carry with them to go to the station. I remember my mother had a large pillowcase full of dry bread, and she had a beautiful fur coat. When we got to the railroad station, it was too heavy for her. She said, well, the bread is most important. So she put the fur coat on a lamppost and just left it there. But she took that dry bread with us. And believe it or not, we lived on that dry bread for probably a week because we had no food at all except for that dry bread.
Виїхали з Мадярщини. Також останнім поїздом військовим, які бомбардували цілий час.
The Soviet planes started bombing, so we all went into the ditches next to the railroad tracks to protect ourselves, and people got killed right very nearby. Then the train started moving. People started screaming, you know, run to the train, so we all ran to the train.
It was very scary because at night you have all of these guerrillas, you have all this underground, they were shouting, shots fired all over the place. And especially when we were in Czechoslovakia, they were kind of wondering why we were escaping. Because they were saying, there was always, I remember that, "Prečo utikate?" Why are you leaving? Saying the Soviets are our friends.
Вони не розуміли, чому ми від москалів втікають. Ми їм вияснили, як могли. Відтам ми поїхали до Німеччини, і там нас зловили, і ми попали до Штрасгофу. Ну і нас взяли там, в ряд поставили, діти, жінки, мужчини, і був перегляд чистоти так званої, то роздягнулися всі, мали ще роздягнути, дощ, погода, зимно чи тепло, потім всі групами йшли до лазень, брали душ, ну і потім там призначили їх до бараків.
We were washed and stripped. We were in a camp that had barbed wire, that had soldiers or guards guarding us with guns. We were starved. And we were slaves.
The number of people who had fled the communists were probably close to about 25 million. Of that number, something like 13 to 14 million were Germans who were fleeing from Eastern Europe and parts of the former German state. Then there were roughly 13, 14, possibly more millions of East Europeans, Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, Balts, Poles, and many, many others who were also fleeing westward. So you're talking about, you know, let's say anywhere between 20 and 30 million people who suddenly show up in Germany in 1945, 46. I mean, this is an astoundingly large number. And not only do they show up in Germany, but it's a country in ruins.
I was released by the end of the war. And at that time, well, my cousin was in Ravensbrück too. And she was, and then we found my mother and my aunt, and we started living as good as we could, you know.
They said, Raus, Raus, leave, and we left. And we didn't know where to go. Just keep walking. No food, nothing. We were sleeping in ditches. And then the Americans came. My sister always called American soldiers our saviors. She just didn't call American soldiers no soldiers, just saviors.
UNRWA, то є United Nations Rehabilitation and Relief Organization, провадити табори, що до них там можна дістатися. І ми поїхали до Карсфельду. То є ДП табор. Він був великий, засадничо, так як я знаю, тільки український. Я думаю, що там було між 4-5 тисяч українців.
You were taken care of. You didn't have much of anything, but from day to day, you were fed. You got some clothing, nothing fancy, hand-me-downs from Americans and so forth, but you were taken care of.
See, this is life in DP camps. See, we were living in barracks like this. The walls were just separated by sheets or blankets. I think common bathrooms, you know, showers and things, so there was hardly any privacy.
We learned how to use the things that we never saw in life before, you know. Peanut butter, dried eggs, things like that, which we never saw, you know. But we used it, we learned, and tried to do the best you can.
It took a very long time before I would speak. You know, I had a very traumatic time in school, although I guess everybody complained that this was a camp, there was no food, you were in line to get some soup or bread or whatever. It was the first time that I remember, you know, pleasant memories.
Even though we didn't have very much to eat, our life was so full. it was even better for me than in our country. We were sorry to leave our country, and here we had everything. Churches, schooling, even opera. It was organized, and they traveled from one camp to the other and performed opera.
Camps did something for us that we really needed, the young people particularly needed, because we were able to go to school. We had SUM, the Ukrainian youth organization. We had Plast, the Boy Scout group.
Так сказати, активностей було перше українське джемборі. Яке відбулося, скажімо, 20 кілометрів за Міттенвальдом.
We couldn't get uniforms, so if we could get just a shirt like the army wore, we used that and then, had a skirt or something to go with it, whatever you had.
Була співпраця між таборами. Дуже багато пластунів, значить, тисячі і тисячі пластунів, які приїхали на то перше всеукраїнське джемборі.
That was the best part of my childhood, was in displaced persons camps. For me, it was home, because the home that I remember was horrible.
In a way, every little camp was a mini Ukraine. And it's within this mini Ukraine context that you establish friendships, contacts, you build institutions, you build organizations, right? You're able to practice your language. There's no one to tell you you can't speak Ukrainian. You're able to practice your culture. There's no one to tell you that you can't do that. Constantly attending lectures, getting involved in fistfights over politics. They were publishing magazines, they were publishing newspapers. Tons of organizations, tons of activities, from the most political to the least political.
Організація табору то було позитивне. Негативне було то, що ті дискусії не раз розсварювали громаду. Дві речі, що про таке, що я собі пригадую як дитина, що про то говорили багато. Чи прапор має бути жовто-синий, чи сино-жовтий наш прапор. За то йшла сварка, не знаю як довго.
These are some of the publications from the camps. Father Frost is fleeing George Orwell's Animal Farm. Art of Displaced Persons. Dedicated to the nations of the world which made the organizations of UNRWA and IRO. UNRWA officer, oil. Camp leader, clay. And so you can see these are people of considerable accomplishment, who are in limbo. And what did they do? They made the best of their situation.
So I think the key here to understanding what was going on in those 3, 4, 5 years is that Ukrainians were being forced and trained to beat Ukrainians. These camps were a crucible of Ukrainian culture and civil society.
To the credit of the United Nations, the United States, these folks were well taken care of, with the exception of those that were forced to go back in Operation Keelhaul.
For the first year or so, Russians were allowed to roam the West American zone as they wanted. And they would say that all of the people here are traitors, they are Nazi collaborators, we want them back.
Everybody has memories of some kind of massacres, of some kind of Soviet atrocities, of Soviet repression. So when they wind up in the camps, and the Soviets are sending in commissions to repatriate, as it were, former citizens. I mean, this is, of course, a source of enormous fear and anxiety. These weren't just Ukrainians, I mean, they were also Russians, Belarusians, and many others.
Поляки поїхали всі до Польщі, італійці до своєї, кримівці, а українці не хочуть ніде їхати. І литовці, і естонці також. Вони боялися вертатися. То люди тікали, боялися. Навіть були випадки, що з поверху люди скакали і гинули, знову, щоб вбити себе, бо він каже, я не хочу до Росії їхати, бо там мене нічого добре не чекає.
They were putting the young men and closing the doors. Well, there were some soldiers guarding the place with rifles. The ladies got very upset and they started to move against these soldiers. And my mother was one of those ladies that went and she took the rifle away from the soldiers. My father and I, we became petrified, not knowing what was going to happen to our mother. Luckily, there was an interpreter that came in and tried to explain to what the problem was, what was happening. And finally the soldiers said, well, I don't know, something is, maybe we should find out what is what.
That operation was eventually suspended when there was an increasing awareness of just how brutal the Soviets were, that there was little difference, if any, between them and the Nazis in terms of how they treated people.
Everybody was desperate to get out of Germany. My parents were convinced, like thousands of other parents, that our survival opportunity is to get out of Europe, anywhere.
People were going to South America, people were going to Canada, to Australia. My father wanted to go to America.
The United States had an open door policy at the beginning of the 20th century. Millions upon millions came to the US. And then in the 1920s, those quotas were significantly reduced. Borders were not exactly closed, but were certainly made more impermeable. And as you may also know, the US policy towards Jews in Europe was also pretty much a closed-door policy.
Many people said that these displaced persons were degenerates, criminals who would make no positive contribution to America. And in fact, that the Soviets would use this as a way of infiltrating communist spies, communist agents. Obvious echoes to today. there was a great deal of support from the already existing ethnic communities in the United States who were lobbying Congress, who were looking for sponsors for people who are coming here, people who need jobs and homes.
When we finally found a sponsor in America, somebody who would sign papers for you that they would guarantee you work, they would, accept you and so forth. We went on General Blatchford, big army ship. My sister, her husband, and my mother and father and I. Took 7 days to cross the Atlantic.
It was something else to remember because you were getting wonderful food, but the only thing is you couldn't eat because of the ship that was moving around. Everybody was getting sick from being there.
We come into New York Harbor and you see the Statue of Liberty and you see the city all lit up. I've never seen that much life during the war. The cars are driving and so on, and we're standing there. And I'm saying to my father, I said, is this real? Or is this propaganda because we grew up with the propaganda, Or is this propaganda to show us how great it is in America? My father says it's real.
From Boston, we went to the farm in Johnsonville. Well, you can just imagine. My father, a judge. Roman, a pharmacist. Luba never worked a day in her life. My mother never worked a day in her life. These were not farm working people. So the poor farmer, he was so disappointed because he signed for us for at least a year to get farm help. But these were not people to do anything except maybe me picking up eggs after the chicken.
We didn't have any sponsors other than ZUDAK. ZUDAK was the Ukrainian American organization that was helping the immigrants that didn't have places to go. They made a deal with plantation owner in Mississippi, and they loaded up about 30 families that didn't know where to go or place to go, loaded us on a couple of Greyhound buses, and took us to Mississippi. Well, here we came, and of course, we're going to pick cotton. We don't know a thing about cotton, what it looks like, or anything at all. They split us up into 4 families to a house, and a house is a shack probably the size of this room. John is on the outside. You see through the walls, mud all over the place. We're saying, this cannot be. This is America. I mean, as bad as things were during the war, this was worse.
My father, he was a judge. For a while, he worked in a sugar candy factory. He had a heart attack while he was carrying a sack of sugar.
For me, when I came to the United States, I was, first of all, it was not very pleasant impression. I went through, my first stop was in Louisiana, somewhere in New Orleans. And when I saw those for colored only, or we stopped, wanted to have the beer where the black people were drinking, and they said, no, you cannot have it. And for me, it was almost like I'm back in Nazi Germany. Believe it or not. And I was sort of, well, why did I come here? And for all the time, I was always somehow planning that I will go to Ukraine, that's the place where I'm supposed to be. Well, I went, but I was coming back here because there was another reason for me to come here. She's the reason.
But our people are very, they are street smart. Everybody had a little reserve somewhere. My father had $50 sewed up here in a lapel in his coat. And I said to my father, I said, you know what? Why don't you give me those $50 and I will buy a bus ticket to get to Connecticut. Connecticut, because I read in the papers that in Connecticut they were offering jobs. And you know, my father had enough faith that he said, okay, I will do that. I got as far as Washington, no more money. I worked for 2 weeks, earned some more money, came to Connecticut. Got a job in a textile mill, got a few bucks, brought my parents up, but that was a shock. And that's what I reflected to my father. I said, see, what we saw in New York was propaganda, because this is America.
But my mother was sick, she had cancer, and she couldn't work or anything. So I had to work to be able, you know, to pay for the apartment and to support us. But my mother passed away within a year.
We came in through New York like everybody else, through Ellis Island, and then we went directly to Cleveland. This is when we were coming to the United States, our arrival in the United States. And that's my mother. Mother had some friends that already settled in Cleveland. So by the time we came, they already bought a house, and they gave us their apartment that they rented, which was right across from the Ukrainian Catholic Church on 7th Street. Many of these first immigrants, they were strictly an economic immigration. The immigration after World War II, they left for political reasons. And for them, there was no way to go back. Consequently, they brought all the cultural stuff with them. Naukovic Tovaristvo Shevchenka, UVAN. They formed their own professional organizations. And of course, they started Plast again. And the same thing was happening in cities across the United States.
We developed a family feeling for one another. You know, I still have friends that are still alive from camp. And I see them, it's like seeing a brother or seeing a sister, and not somebody that I know, not an acquaintance, not a friend, but it's really a family type of relationship.
I remember my father would say, I know him, I know him, I know him, I know him. Right? Someone in Detroit, someone in Chicago, someone in Toronto, someone in Philadelphia, DC. And, you know, how do you know these people? But the answer is very simple. For 4 years, they bunked together. They went out drinking together. They went on dates together. They were studying together. They were doing politics together. You suddenly have this entire network of friends, and, you know, after a number of years, you know, they all move around, but you still know them. And that's one of the reasons for the vitality of the diaspora in the 1950s, 60s, because the vitality of the camps was essentially transferred to the vitality of the U.S.
The community made sure that everybody stayed in touch. You did go to festivals, you did go to concerts. They would invite groups to come and perform. You know, always went caroling, always learning songs, also camping. Święto Wesny, Ivana Kupala, where we were doing wreaths and throwing them on the water, and then wherever your wreath ended up, that's who you were going to marry. So all these traditions, you know. But I think what developed my personality, if I can say that, is really the interaction with scouts and choir and the community.
After I married and we had kids, we decided that our home is Ukrainian home. And I thought that the only thing that I can do for my country that was occupied by Russians, that I can keep Ukrainian home, teach my children Ukrainian, and teach them to be proud to be Ukrainians and not to be afraid to say who they are and what they are.
For all these years, we have really, you know, had here at home all the holidays, teaching the children to do the eggs. than the Easter baskets that go to church to be blessed. Whatever we could do to pass on the culture of Ukraine and make the distinction that you're not Russian, you are Ukrainian.
You know, people talk about the United States being a melting pot. I believe that the United States is a garden of flowers, various varieties, but all these flowers with their colors, and they bring beauty to this country because the country is intellectually mature enough to understand that this is not in conflict with being an American.
Чуєш, брате мій, товаришу мій, відлітають сірим шнурком журавлі.
Ukraine is dear to me. To give it any kind of financial, spiritual help that I can, because it is my people that have suffered so much. But really, home is here.
There's no question that, in my view, the land to dream the impossible dream is the United States of America. Although we constantly are talking about Ukraine, trying to help Ukraine, but we are trying to convey to Ukrainians, Ukraine, and others the values that we have obtained in the United States of America.
І дотепер, як я вже маю 92 роки, то Україна для мене це номер один. Я дуже тужу за нею і дуже люблю її. Могла б зробити, що могла б зробити, не можу.
Мерехтить в очах безконечний шлях, гине в сірій мряці слід по журавлях, кличуть кру, в чужині.